Hi, everybody. This is Janet Belsky, and I am on to episode 1 of my Lifespan Lecture Series part called Big Questions in Human Development. And this episode is going to be discussing intelligence, that quality that we all want to have. We're mainly going to be talking about the intelligence tests, and we're really going to decode what exactly do they measure? What don't they measure? What are some of the issues with them? And then we're going to look at how the tests actually apply to careers in adult life and whether they do. Does our score on an IQ test measure our basic genetic intelligence? I think most of us would say, yeah, that score really gives us a good indicator of basically how smart you are. Our IQ measures how well we do in school, predicts how well we're going to do in academics. Is that true or false? Does our IQ predict how well we're going to do in life? So, I'm going to give you a couple of answers here. First of all, there is a little bit of our genetic intelligence involved in the IQ, but a lot of this time I'm going to suggest and back it up that there are a lot of other factors that go into that score besides basically how smart you are. Does the IQ test measure how well we do in school? Yes, and that's how it was devised. So that's pretty good, tends to do that. Does it measure how well we do in life? And there it's kind of a wash, guys. I mean, you can do a little predicting about your life success from the IQ test, but not nearly as much as we may know intuitively. A lot of other things go into being intelligent in life than just your score on that IQ test. I am going to give you the territory of how we got to where we are. And the territory is sorted, which is a great word. Actually, mental measurement, and what we're doing here is comparing people, has been used to put out groups down with the idea that some of us are basically genetically smarter than other of us. And now by looking at 19th century scientists, and they're going to get really scientific and prove that certain people are just basically smarter than other people. They're going to prove that women are mentally inferior because if you measure our skulls, they're smaller than the skulls of a male. Now, notice they didn't control for the body size, but what the hell? And worse yet, we're going to prove that immigrants are just genetically not smarter than the regular population. Now, this is very important because for those of you that are into history, the early 20th century, a thing called the eugenics movement was very powerful. And basically the idea is we want to have America be a race of better people. Okay, so imagine getting off the boat here and somebody gives you an IQ test. You really don't know English very well. How are you going to do? Most of the Jews were classified as feeble-minded. Most of the Jews, Italians, or of course, Southern Europeans are also classified as feeble-minded. So you decide, which they did in the 1920s, that you are going to limit immigration. And there was a bill signed by President Wilson that Southern and Eastern European immigration is only going to be 2% of the census in 1890. There was a big push to sterilize, quote, feeble-minded adults. And here we have a newspaper. The decision was held toward a super race. Health officials praised the court in upholding the sterilization law. And basically, if you were classified as feeble-minded, the government could actually make you unable to procreate. Here's another. Heredity is a big problem because the home for feeble-minded is filled with those whose parents were not as carefully selected as dairymen. Breed cattle. That was the model. We can breed a super race. As we all know, the logical end of that is Hitler. And here we have this wonderful emblem of eugenics, which is Auschwitz. There's a super race, and we're going to get rid of the people who do not fit in that particular category. And that was really an object lesson to the world in the fallacy of deciding that certain people are genetically superior to other people. And so after Hitler, we decided we're not going to have anything to do with that eugenics stuff at all. We were really revolted by all that stuff and where it could go. But we can use the test the IQ test to predict how well kids are doing in school. So let's look at the procedure here. First of all, you're sitting in the class, and usually these are done they are almost always done in elementary school. And it looks like these two girls are so far ahead of the rest of the class. And so the parents, usually it's the parents, will say, I'd like to have my kid tested to be in the gifted program. If you have another issue, you may have a kid back here who's having trouble reading. Is it just a reading problem, or is the kid generally not good at the school stuff? So they're going to refer the child to a psychologist, and the psychologist is going to give what we call what I'm going to call the W test. It's the one is the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for children. That's the standard test that's given. So you get to the psychologist, and the person will spend, a morning with the kid, getting the kid relaxed. And then they'll give, a series of little tests, trying to make it sort of fun so the child isn't anxious. And by the way, very important that this test is given individually, because if you give it in a group, you really can't tell about the kid's motivation or anything like that. So when I was giving these tests, which was a long, long time ago, to be honest with you guys, we really carefully looked at how motivated the kid was to take them. This is the full scale IQ. That's the number that gives you a benchmark of everything you're doing. But then it's divided into a section that's called the verbal IQ and the performance IQ. The verbal IQ just means they're going to ask you questions and you're going to answer them. But then it's divided into other parts. And here's some of the questions: your vocabulary, your similarities, how much you know. Here's an arithmetic, your other questions. The performance IQ, they're going to give you little things and you're going to have to do them within a certain amount of time. We'll get there in 1 second. And also that is divided into different subtests too. So you have a whole array of different tests measuring those aspects of the kid's performance. Okay, so here's some sample items I'll go over very briefly. Vocabulary, what does exhausted mean? Arithmetic questions and verbally, and you have to do it in your mind. This is logic. What should you do if you found a letter in the street? And here's an example of something that's on the performance, a classic. I'm giving you a set of blocks, and they're going to have different, some of them are half white, some of them are all red, and I want you to put them together to make this particular shape on a card. That's called block design. So the person adds up the items, and then they do something very important, which is, you might imagine, which is how does each number, each one of those subtest scores compare to children that age? And then you add it up and you get the familiar bell-shaped curve. 100 is how 50% of the kids your age are typically doing. 68% get between 85 and 115. And then you go up the range. If you get up to 130, you're eligible to be in the gifted class. That's one of the criteria. There are other criteria too, but that's one of the major criteria there. Okay, now if we look at it, 130 basically means that out of every 100 kids, your kids scored better than, there are only 2 kids, and yours is one of them that scored as well. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little caveat here. If you look at the fact that there are lots of different tests, in order to be gifted, well, you basically have to do well on almost everything in order to be gifted. And there are a lot of gifted kids who might do well on some parts, fabulously well, and not as well on the other parts. But you have to do well on everything to basically be put in the accelerated class. And of course, if you're below average, then you're eligible for special help. Issue 1 is knowing you and your child's IQ, good or bad. There are actually perils in childhood and in adulthood, but mainly in childhood, for being labeled gifted. One of the perils, as we know, is the kid gets a very swelled head, and they figure, what's your IQ? Hey, I have a higher IQ than you do. I'm smarter than you. But I think one of the basic perils was pointed out by a woman named Carol Dweck, where she said she gave kids tests. One group, she said, you're gifted, because it's got the same score on the test. And the other group, she said, this is an experiment, she said something like, if you work hard, you can do better. And the kids in the if you work hard group ended up doing better than the kids in the group that was labeled gifted, because the kids who were gifted said, I don't have to work at all. Actually, if you don't work, forget it. So working hard is very important in excelling in life, as we all know. Then we come to the second major issue. Is the IQ score genetic or due to the environment? Is it a genetic thing or is it the environment? Now, somewhat it is genetic, but we have a lot of evidence that it's heavily dependent on the environment you're in. And here's our major, beautiful study. When they devised the IQ tests, and then they looked at how they changed over time, they found that a score that would be seen as average, that's in the 50th percentile, in 1900 would rank as mentally deficient today. Bottom line is our education has changed dramatically. If you're in a one-room schoolhouse and you're compared to kids, most of whom at that point didn't even, some of them didn't even go to school, that population is going to be very different than if you're now with 21st century computer kids. We really got much smarter. Did we get smarter over the 20th century, or did our educational experiences change a lot? That's called the Flynn effect, by the way, that change in the mean and the distribution of IQ based over time. So here we go with a, really more concrete example. Does your education affect your IQ? And the answer is, of course it does. If you look back at those tests, they're measuring vocabulary, completely dependent on the kind of experiences you have. Even the blocks that you're putting together depend on whether your parents are giving you those kinds of wonderful, nurturing experiences in preschool and in school. If you grow up in a place like this, let's be honest, your parents are working all the time. They don't have time to do that stuff. And not only that, as we all know, school systems differ dramatically depending on where you live. That's why you want to get your kid into a good school system, an A school system, because everybody knows that gives you the leg up, not just in getting into college, but in your IQ score. And here comes the kicker. Not only do we have those experiences, but if you have the money, guys, you can prep for the test. You can take your kid and you can have the kid study for the test. I was guilty of it too, but that's what parents do. They want to push their kid ahead. Okay, so now we're in a different category. Does the test really measure what makes us intelligent? It's measuring academics, but it's really missing a lot of talents. So here we have our particular gurus, man named Robert Sternberg and Howard Gardner, psychologists. This guy's more in education, but they have specified that we have different kinds of intelligence. And here's one kind that particularly Gardner talked about. He said we have a musical intelligence. And this guy's really good at the trombone. I don't know how he's going to do on the IQ test, though. Here's another kind of intelligence, which is art painting. And I'm getting up to this girl here, and here's another kind of intelligence, which is very important. How good you are socially, not measured by the test, not nothing to do with the test. This is another type of creative intelligence, which it's completely unrelated maybe to artistic ability, but your kid designed all of these wonderful costumes for Halloween. That kid is really, really creative. Test isn't going to measure any of that stuff. And here's another kind that I think really, if we think about it more deeply, it is part of intelligence. How good you are physically, how coordinated you are, how well you really can master tasks in the physical world. Here, finger dexterity, things like that. Those are not measured on the intelligence test. And you might want to take a minute now and think about some of the other skills that the test does not measure that are very important in life. Okay, so today, people are smarter about the test. One thing that they do, and I think this is really very, very important, is they look at the pattern of your scores on the various subtests. And they say, well, this kid is really good at vocabulary, but he's not so good at putting the puzzles together. This is a talent. They're looking at it in the way to look at different talents rather than just the score. So he has an IQ of, let's say, 120, but that covers, you could be very different from kid to kid with the same IQ of 120. So if it's a question of getting special help, that gives you a lot of data on what some of the issues are where they may need special, I would say, special tutoring or special help. Always take the educational background into account. So if your kid or a kid is attending one of these, quote, failing schools, and they score 100 on the test, the person looks at the thing and they say, wow, this kid would really, really be doing like 130 if they were in the right school. There's a lot more potential for kids living in poverty to get higher scores. Now, if you're living in an upper middle class environment, got the best experiences, and you still didn't do well on the test, then you say to yourself, well, I think this is about where this kid, that's about the top of where this kid should be. Before we move on, I have to tell you a little anecdote about my private school where I went. One of the kids in the middle of, and by the way, I was also, in the middle or the bottom of the class, but one of the kids in the middle of our class, where people said things like, well, she's really working hard, but she's just not that genetically intelligent. She went on to be unbelievably successful. Now, as a matter of fact, she was the head of the school, and she was the head, and everybody thought she was like really the best head of school in New York. And she was the one that people said, she's working hard, but what good is that? She's not genetically intelligent. That's where that one can go. Okay, so we're going to move on briefly to a similar kind of issue. The test scores do relate to economic success because they're putting you on a platform of going to the right college. They're putting you, your kinds of skills are going to predict maybe within limits, okay? The test scores simply cannot predict a lot. And one of the things they can't predict is who's going to really make the world-class contributions in like now, if we looked at Dolly Parton's IQ compared to other people's IQs, I am sure that she would score lower than like a Mensa genius. But there she is making world-class contributions because her talents are in a different area. This is Nelson Mandela. The same thing would be true of him if he gave him an IQ test. Well, he scored really well, but not as well as this person who was in Mensa. I think this is the most compelling example, though. Here we have Darwin. Now, just to give you a little background, Darwin's cousin scored 200 on the IQ tests, and he was a genius. I think Darwin's, there's a controversy because he never took a test, but, some people put his IQ at 130, some people put his IQ at 140, but he certainly wasn't anything like his cousin, Galton, who was the highest IQ that they could measure. And look at what Darwin did, and how many of you heard of Galton? World-class contributions don't relate to your IQ. So what did the tests tell us about how you're going to do in your career? And here we do have some interesting answers. Basically, the tests are measuring two different kinds of intelligence. In particular, the performance part, where you physically do something, is measuring what we call fluid skills. You have to do something new within a certain length of time, and it measures how quickly you can do something new. And the verbal part is measuring things like your vocabulary, how much you know. Those are called crystallized skills. That's how much you know. And the verbal skills, we're going to talk a lot about this in our other lectures, tend to rise as you get older, those kinds of skills, how much you know. But the fluid skills, that's how quickly you can do new things, tend to decline really after young adulthood, or starting maybe in the 20s and 30s, how quickly you can do new tasks. That's a standard. So we can look at specific jobs using the fluid crystallized distinction. Now, in certain jobs, there's going to be more of a mix of fluid skills. So if you're an airline pilot, you have a lot of crystallized intelligence in being a pilot, but you also have to be very quick to respond. So pilots have a cutoff. They have to retire at 65, mandatory. Makes a lot of sense because the fluid stuff just really is declining rapidly certainly by that age. Okay, now we have an interesting thing, which is surgery. A lot of experience involved, a lot of crystallized stuff, but there is an element of quickness in surgery. Would you want to have a surgeon in his 70s? Now, I don't want to just be ageist. I want to be accurate. I think that would make me nervous. I think I'd like a surgeon probably at the age where you have your maximum crystallized and fluid, which would be somewhere around the 40s or even maybe the early 50s. But in this final career, and luckily I'm in it, it's a good news, you're doing things that don't depend at all on being quick. So writing a book, understanding history, those are careers where really people do their best, maybe in their 60s and 70s. That's a peak age for crystallized work, is later in life. Okay, so now we're going to predict your career smarts from the research. And I'm adapting my findings from a man named Dean Simonton, whose whole life was devoted to figuring out how well people do depending on their careers at certain ages. When do geniuses do their best work? That would be one of his things. And he finds that your initial competence is very important. I mean, some of us are talented in certain areas and others aren't. The more talented you are in your 20s and 30s, that's going to predict how well you're likely to do later on, with a lot of exceptions, of course, but we're all looking at statistics. As crystallized skill increases, the performance gets better, and typically the 50s is the time when we do our best work, particularly in crystallized kinds of fields. But as I just mentioned, it's going to vary because there are careers where you may do your best work certainly in your 30s or 20s, like dancing, things like that. Varies depending on the mix of those skills. And finally, people can do exceptional work in old age if they're highly motivated to continue and in crystallized fields. And here we have examples of people who did wonderful work in old age. This is Frank Lloyd Wright, who designed the Guggenheim Museum in his 90s, or maybe he didn't design it, it was put up in his 90s. Designing it in his 80s. And here we have Michelangelo. This is the Sistine Chapel, and he did that work in his 60s. Not bad. And of course, we have an exemplar today, and we have Steven Spielberg, who at this particular moment, I think he's my age, probably his mid-70s, has just put forth a wonderful movie. Now, is it better than his earlier movies? Well, at least it's just as good. He's burning bright creatively into later life. Bottom line, the IQ test measures school abilities well, but the score needs to be looked at in the context of each child's educational experience is very important. We're not all equal educationally, and that really affects your score. The test doesn't measure the range of real-world gifts that we have by any means. The IQ, can it predict who excels in life? Not really. It has a little bit of predictability, but not the way we would think just by saying to ourselves, I have a high IQ. You can be mighty disappointed in your life if that's the way you think about your IQ score. Mighty disappointed. So here's an exercise. What do you think it really means to be intelligent in life? You might take a couple of minutes and list the qualities that to you mean somebody's intelligent. And they're going to be different for all of us. We all have different ideas about what we see as an intelligent person. You can build on that. One of the things that I would look at in this context is people that I see as my intelligence gurus or my living life well gurus. And I'm going to look to those particular qualities really as kind of benchmarks of where I want to go as a human being. If you like this talk, you can join me at the next lecture. You can join me on my website as I draw on my half-century writing college textbooks to explain what scientists know about the mystery of our life. Here's Big Questions in Being Human, which we're doing now. We have a growing up section with 4 parts, and we have a growing old section that's also going to have 4 parts. So I hope to see you in the next lecture, which I'm going to give very soon.